Well, it's a pleasure to see everybody and to be able to introduce Marty Franks. Uh, After a 25-year career at the company, Martin D. Franks, Executive Vice President of the CBS Corporation, retired in 2013. Franks managed a wide range of activities for CBS, including serving as liaison to the CBS Board of Directors, CBS's strategic planning process, oversight of the corporation's activities in Washington, D.C., as well as with state and local governments, and CBS's corporate philanthropy. He reported to and took on numerous special projects for CBS's president and chief executive officer. He divided his time among offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington. Franks joined CBS in 1988 as Vice President, Washington, responsible for the activities of CBS before Congress, the Federal Communications Commission, and other government bodies. He was made Senior Vice President, Washington in 1994. In 1997, he was named Senior Vice President, CBS Corporation, in charge of its corporate relations functions, including government and investor relations, corporate communications, and liaison to the company's board of directors. In May of 2000, upon the merger of CBS and Viacom, Franks was named Executive Vice President of CBS Television and Senior Vice President of Viacom. From 1972 through 1987, Franks held a number of posts in Washington, including Chief of Staff for Senator Patrick Leahy and on the 1980 campaign and White House staff of President Jimmy Carter. From 1981 until 1987, he was Executive Director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee under Thomas P. Tip O'Neill and Congressman Tony Coelho. Franks has served on numerous boards, including Washington, D.C.'s Sidwell Friends School, the National Association of Broadcasters, the Advertising Council, and Maximum Service Television. He was also on the executive committee of the board of the September 11th Fund. Franks was born and raised in Long Beach, Indiana. He is a graduate of Western Reserve Academy in Hudson, Ohio, on whose board he serves, and for which he chaired its recent Excellence and Access Capital Campaign. He's a graduate of Princeton University with a BA in politics, and he and his lovely wife, Sherry, herself a 20-year veteran of CBS, live in Washington, D.C. And it's a pleasure to have known Marty for a while, and I welcome you wholeheartedly. Thank you, Marty.
Well, thank you, Kathy. After that introduction, I almost feel like I should go straight to Q&A. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm flattered as I look at the list of who's on. My old friend and roommate, David Hunter, and Britt and Skip Flanagan. I'm a bunch of phone numbers, so I don't recognize the rest, but it's a pleasure to be here. I want to try and do 50 years in 15 minutes so that there's plenty of time for questions. I came to Northeastern Ohio, to Western Reserve Academy from a small town in Indiana, Long Beach, right on the lake across from Chicago. Not many people from Long Beach really leave Long Beach very often, and certainly not for some of the places I ended up in my career. And I really think that it's because I came to Western Reserve Academy as a skinny 13-year-old in the fall of 1964, and Reserve opened my eyes to a whole new world that didn't necessarily occur to a middle-class kid whose mom was a school nurse and whose dad was a traveling salesman. And so, yes, I'm proud that I went to Princeton, but I am much more who I am because of Western Reserve Academy. And it's interesting to me, when I did chair the Capital Campaign, as Kathy mentioned, I literally spoke to hundreds of Reserve alums, many of whom I hadn't known previously. And the interesting shared comment in almost all of those conversations, there was a variation on Western Reserve Academy changed my life. And it is certainly true for me, and it became the springboard for what I want to describe to you the rest of the way. So after I graduated from Princeton in 1972, I had I'd worked on some political campaigns while I was in college, mostly anti-war campaigns or for anti-war candidates. And so I headed off to Washington a week after graduation to do my bit to end the war in Vietnam. And I was very fortunate to become the most junior staff person at $100 a week for the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee in 1972. The entity of this campaign committee is an entity of the Democratic caucus in the Senate, dedicated to electing more Democrats to the Senate. My first campaign, my principal campaign in 1972 as a 22-year-old was helping a 29-year-old from Delaware get elected to the Senate. His name was Joe Biden, beginning a friendship of 50 years. So I will warn you in advance, I am highly biased, and we can talk about that a little bit if you want in the Q&A. Interesting enough, my 74 campaign, my principal effort was Patrick Leahy from Vermont. He is now the he was a 33-year-old county prosecutor and the first Democrat ever elected to the Senate from Vermont. You know, it's funny now with Bernie Sanders there, and you know, it's kind of the People's Republic of Vermont, but a lot of people don't remember what a red state it was, and Patrick was the first Democrat elected to the Senate from Vermont. From there, in 1975 and 6, I moved to Los Angeles, where I did a really lousy job of getting a senator named John Tunney reelected. Some of you who are old enough may remember that his father was Gene Tunney, the heavyweight champion of the world. John Tunney had the unfortunate tag of being called the lightweight son of the heavyweight champ, and we lost to the president of San Francisco State University, S.I. Hayakawa. Not one of my finer moments. I came back to Washington, and I was Pat Leahy's chief of staff for a couple of years. And then a funny thing happened. When I was still working for the Senate Campaign Committee in '74, Robert Strauss was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and he appointed the then lame duck governor of Georgia, a guy named Jimmy Carter, to head up a special effort within the Democratic National Committee to try and get more Democrats elected to state legislatures around the country. So for the rest of 1974, I traveled around the country working on my campaigns, and I frequently traveled with a fellow named Hamilton Jordan, who was Jimmy Carter's chief of staff. Like I said, I did that great job of getting John Tunney defeated in 1976. So on election day in 1977, I'm sitting in Los Angeles unemployed, and there's Jimmy Carter and Hamilton and Jody Powell watching Jimmy take the oath of office. So I had done some odd jobs for President Carter, you know, mostly advanced work on some trips and stuff when they needed an extra hand. And Hamilton called me one morning in the fall of '79 when Carter was way behind Kennedy in the polls. It didn't even look like he might survive till the State of the Union, much less the election. And Hamilton wanted me to become the deputy campaign manager and really the Reaganologist, if you will, of the campaign. I told him I had a good job that paid a steady wage, and I wasn't sure they were going to make it. I got invited to Camp David that weekend for a meeting that it was not that unusual, but President walked into the meeting and was not in a good mood because of some other things that were going on, and Hamilton was talking about what needed to be done in the campaign, and at one point the president slammed his hand on the table and said, "Hamilton, you've been telling me for months that you were going to get that done, and you haven't gotten it done. I want to know how you're going to get it done." And the president was sitting between Hamilton and me. Hamilton kind of leaned forward and pointed at me and said, "We're going to get Marty to do it." At that point, I went to work for the leader of the free world for the next 14 months. I kept a packed bag in my office because I was never quite sure if I was going to go home to sleep that night as opposed to getting shipped to some state somewhere to work on a problem. It was a fabulous experience, obviously not a wonderful outcome, but Jimmy Carter is is obviously a better former president than he was current president. And one of the great I have had two great delights in my life in the last few years. One was being in a car driving and hearing that Jimmy Carter had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Caught me emotionally, and one of the great regrets of my life is that I was invited to go and I couldn't. And then several years ago, actually driving to Hudson, President Carter was on when he had his cancer surgery, and they asked him how long he expected to live. And his answer was, I want to outlive the last guinea worm in Africa. You may perhaps know that in his charitable work, he has done wonderful work in Africa on health issues, and one of them is eradicating guinea worm disease. Anyway, I'll move on. So there I was, unemployed again after the '80 election. And I had, as I said, I was the Reaganologist for the campaign and fairly prominently identified as such. I was hired then by my friend Tony Quello, who had been, we'd known each other as staffers. He was now a congressman. Nobody wanted to run the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the House counterpart of the Senate entity I'd worked for, because you were seen as being targeted for defeat. I was going to go back to business school. And I told Tony, you know, I'll come help you for 3 months to kind of get it straightened out, but I'm out of town. I've had it, you know, but I've lost 2 in a row. It's probably time for another line of work. He said, sure, 3 months. Well, 3 months became 6 years. In those 6 years, we were the only Democratic entity in town that had any power. And thus we were frequently cast as the opposition to President Reagan. Speaker O'Neill was obviously kind of the most visible Democratic figure. I'm sure it's just a coincidence that in those 6 years, my taxes were audited 4 times. Somehow or other, my name just kept coming up in that computer. But despite a Reagan landslide in '84 that was bigger and deeper than his win in '80, in the '82, '84, and '86 elections, we actually added to the number of Democrats in the House, something I'm more than a little proud of. So about that time, my late wife who had worked in politics and then quit in disgust shortly after we met, disgust with politics, not with me, decided it was time for me to get a grown-up job. Somehow 2 little boys had been born during that time, almost a miracle given the amount of time I spent on the road, but 2 little boys came along and it was time for a grown-up job. And about that time, the Tisch brothers, Larry and Bob Tisch, very prominent New York commercial real estate businessmen, and very large Democratic donors, particularly to Hubert Humphrey. The Tisch brothers had taken over CBS. And Larry Tisch called me one day and asked me to go to work for CBS to run the Washington office, would, you know, in essence, be the Washington lobbyist for CBS. I readily accepted, particularly since I was unemployed, and it was a fascinating time. You know, it's 20 now, 32 years ago, but it may be hard for you. There was wide speculation that there were still only 3 networks. Fox didn't come along until several years later. And it was widely thought that one of the networks, and probably CBS, was going to go under. So it was a very tough environment, and it was a tough environment really because of 2 government restrictions. One, in revenge, if you will, for Watergate, Nixon, if you go back in the Nixon tapes, he tells Haldeman to figure out a way to punish the 3 networks for their news coverage of Watergate. And so they put into place something called the financial interest and syndication rules, which basically meant that the 3 television networks couldn't own any of the programming they put on. So if you remember the first Cosby Show that was on NBC and was a huge hit, huge national phenomenon, when it was sold into syndication, for reruns, the price tag set a record for those days of $500 million. Of that amount, NBC, which obviously played a pretty big role in making it a hit, NBC received zero of that 500 million because of these financial interest rules. So one of my assignments was to get those repealed, which fortunately we did. And just to give you a sense of scale, and obviously the dollars are different so many years later, CBS owns a little franchise called CSI. Because CBS, whoops, now we're getting an echo. There we go. Because CBS owns CSI, CBS has made $4 billion, that's with a B, $4 billion from the CSI franchise. So that was instrumental. The other cockamamie item in the legislative agenda was that in those days, the cable operators could take CBS's programming for free and resell it to each of you. It was a great business. You got your most popular programming for free and then sold it at a considerable markup. We got something passed called retransmission consent, which requires cable operators to get the permission of a broadcaster. So every once in a while, you probably notice that one of your stations goes off your cable system because the cable operator and the broadcaster can't agree on the price. Right now, that retransmission consent is worth to CBS alone about $2 billion a year. So obviously, it turned the fortunes of not only CBS, but most broadcasters around. I'm biased. I think that's a good thing. So things were rolling along well, and one of my next assignments was to manage CBS's transition to digital television and to high definition television. And so we were very excited because we had the 2004 Super Bowl, and it was going to be the first Super Bowl in high definition. And in those days, you didn't do you still had to broadcast in analog television for all the people who still just had 4x3 old Sony Trinitrons. And then you also did a parallel broadcast in high definition. And then at a Super Bowl, there are 7 or 8 TV trucks. There's one for the game, and there's one for replays. There's one for halftime. We also had one for HD. And because I was in charge of the HD broadcast, I was in the HD truck, which was next door to the game truck. At halftime, this is the 2004 Super Bowl in Houston. At halftime, I went in to talk to the director in the game truck because I was unhappy with the way he was doing the HD, and our HD sponsors were unhappy. And for a football game like that, at halftime, because there's a separate crew doing halftime, all the techs that are in the truck, the game truck, go out to have a cigarette or go to the bathroom or whatever. So it was really only the director, a young production assistant, and me. The PA is just sitting there watching the halftime show and timing it so he can get up and tell the guys, hey, halftime's almost over, time to come back in and do the second half. So the director and I are having a pretty good argument in the back of the truck, and we hear the young PA say, "What was that?" That's never a good thing to hear in a live TV truck. And because it was in high definition, with all of that extra data in the picture, within about 30 seconds, this young PA was able to not only freeze the frame, but zoom way in so much that I could read the inscriptions on Janet Jackson's nipple ring. That began, by the way, most people actually didn't see it because most people were watching in analog television, and from a shot that was quite far away from the stage. Most people didn't really know what had happened until the next day because Miss Jackson and her nipple ring were on the front page of every newspaper in America. Well, thus began your government's 8.5-year attempt to put me in jail. a broadcast license is such that somebody's name has to be on. It can't be a corporation. Somebody's name. There has to be an executive who the FCC can hold responsible if there's a violation. Well, guess what? It wasn't my boss's name. It was my name. So for 8.5 years, I think, well, I know we spent $40 million defending ourselves. I can only imagine what the government spent, all because of Janet Jackson, doing this in the Super Bowl. I gave a speech at Reserve a couple of years ago when Chris Berner was still head, and I warned him that I was going to use the line that after we tried to apologize to anybody who would listen, nobody would accept our apology. And part of what always puzzled me was that this was, after all, something that half the world has two of, and the other half of the world is well aware of that fact, but it didn't get me very far. Remember, I came from this small town in Indiana called Long Beach, and not a lot of prominent people come from Long Beach, Indiana. There is one more, however, a guy that was way behind me in school. His sisters were more my contemporaries. I should have been much, much nicer to him, because he is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. John Roberts grew up about a mile down the street from me. And believe it or not, the Janet Jackson Super Bowl wardrobe malfunction was not resolved until we made two, not one, but two trips to the Supreme Court. And ultimately won, although Chief Justice Roberts was in the minority and was not very happy with CBS or me then or now. I'm almost done. I guess two more thoughts about, one, why I left, and then two, the TV world of today, and then we can do whatever questions you want to do. The pace of change in the TV business is just unbelievable. I mean, a couple of years ago, how many of you would have thought that you would be, streaming a football game on your 60-inch television in your family room? My boss the CEO used to talk about, he felt like he was driving down the road at 80 miles an hour and changing four wheels at the same time. I remember vividly a fellow named Reed Hastings, who is still the CEO of Netflix, coming into my office to pitch. He wanted to license CBS programmings for his DVD by mail business. The pace of change is breathtaking in the television business, and it was no longer a job for a 60-something-year-old. It really has to be the work for younger people. And then the one other thing, yes, the multiplicity of choices and voices is terrific. I think it's also, though, part of what's led to the lack of unity in the country. When in the 80 campaign for Jimmy Carter, we would spend all day working really, really hard trying to shape the minute we were likely to get with Walter Cronkite that night. I paid interns to go to, if Reagan was giving a speech at Kent State, I paid in the basketball arena, I paid an intern to go find the closest pay telephone, call me collect, and hold the phone out so I could hear what Reagan was saying. Well, of course, now everything's live, everything's current, and not only is there one story a day, but there are 6 or 7 news cycles in the day. And, transparency and information is terrific, but it's almost too much information for the public to be able to absorb. And somebody smarter than me is going to have to figure out how we address that and do something about unifying the country again. But with that note, I will stop and see whatever questions you all have. Okay, thanks a lot.
I have a question.
Sure.
Sure. Marty, thank you so much for joining us. Using your political experience, which do you think has been more destructive on our body politic? Newt Gingrich's contract with America or Citizens United decision?
Wow. Well, let me try and answer both if I can. I think Newt, it wasn't so much the contract with America. The contract with America didn't bother me. Newt really began the politics of destruction, of mutual assured destruction. That it wasn't enough to get more votes than your opponent. You had to, kill him, stomp on his grave, and salt the grave. I mean, it just became a degree of ugliness that we really hadn't seen before. I mean, I used to get a call on occasionally, I won't say how often, other than daily. About 4:30, Tip's secretary would call and say, the speaker would like to have you in his office for a special conference at 5 o'clock. Okay. It just meant the bar was going to be open. And I mean, Tip would be there. Bob Michael, the Republican leader, would be there. And, my counterpart on the Republican side. And we'd sit there and talk about the day and what we were going to do tomorrow. And, can you imagine Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy getting together for a drink at 5 o'clock? I can't. So I think it was more just the politics of destruction. And then Citizens United doesn't bother me that much in the sense of taking the caps off corporate spending. What bothers me and the only campaign reform that I've ever seen work is disclosure and rigorous disclosure. And so the fact that now, there is so much money that is not disclosed. If somebody wants to take $10 million from Exxon for their campaign, to me, that needs to be disclosed promptly and well. And this becomes part of your decision about who you want to vote for. The problem I've got now is that there's so much of this money that you never know. Let me tell you, the politician knows about it, the donor knows about it, but the voters don't. And I think that's really destructive. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Mr. Franks?
I have a question for Marty.
No, he doesn't get to ask one. Turn off his mic. His wife is sitting there. I just want to remind him we have mutual assured destruction. So
This is true. This is true. The question is, the current president is really setting the groundwork to be able to call foul after November 3rd if he is not successfully reelected. So what do you see to be the process if in fact that happens on late November 3rd, November 4th, or maybe the 13th of November?
Well, I think it depends on what happens in Florida and Pennsylvania. Trump cannot get reelected without winning both. I mean, there's a website called 270 to Win. You can all go play with it. It's an interactive map of each state and their electoral votes, and so you can play around with how you would get to 270 electoral votes. Trump cannot get to 270 without Pennsylvania and Florida. So if Biden were to win Pennsylvania and Florida by enough that it's not going to get overturned, I think that'll take on a whole different turn, because I think the media and, more importantly, Republican members of Congress who still want to have a career post-Trump will step in. My nightmare, of course, is that it's Florida-like in 2000 and truly kind of unknown, or even worse, some of the projections are that Trump will get many more votes on the day, in-person votes the day of the election, and Biden will get many, many more votes by mail that won't get counted for a week or whatever. I think part of what scares me, I know you're familiar because of your daughter, part of what scares me was watching that Trump parade in Portland 2 weeks ago. Guys are armed, they're shooting pepper spray. I mean, I worry a little bit about I mean, it is far and away not all Trump supporters. So those of you who are, don't misunderstand me. But there are some Trump supporters on the fringe who I could see taking up arms, and that scares me. So what I'm doing is doing whatever I can to help Joe Biden win in Pennsylvania and Florida by as much as he can. But I'll tell you, I hope in each debate, I hope that the moderators are going to ask both candidates a question like what we need to get both candidates firmly on record that they will abide by the results when the results are certified. And so that, one of the candidates has a certain facility with the truth, but I think the more often we can get them on videotape saying, I will abide by the results, it will lead, I hope, to less mischief. But it's something we all should be worrying about.
Okay, I know Marty's on a tight schedule here today, so as you may be aware, we always have a responder to our speaker. And today that's going to be someone you know, Tom Myers. Tom, take it away.
Hey, Tommy.
Hey, thanks.
Don't forget, I know where you live and I know your wife, so.
One of the few people that can call me Tommy. Well, Marty, we those of us who've known you since high school knew that you were going to have a colorful career. We now have learned that you also had a successful career. So who would have known? Just kidding. We've also learned that you lost your political equilibrium some time ago, but we still love you. I hope again that you can come and tell us a little bit more in detail about what happened there with Janet Jackson. It sounds like there could be a lot more to that story. I'll look forward to hearing from you then, and I look forward to seeing you at my reunion next year at Reserve. Thanks for coming.
I'll be there. I wouldn't miss a chance to party with that class of yours.
Thanks for coming, Marty.
Thanks.